have that effect on anyone. Is this working? So good evening, everyone. Before I get started, I just had some notes to remind you to please silence your phone. That would be me too. Please no food and drinks in this beautiful space. We did that all upstairs if you weren't joining us there. We kept it behind. And please think of brilliant questions to ask our guest at the end of the presentation, i.e. that means that there's a Q&A afterwards. Stay put. So thank you to Dora, thank you to Kathy, thank you to the library and the Friends of the Library for collaborating with the Flinn Gallery. And thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. My name is Ellen Hawley, and I'm the curator for Glow, the current exhibit in the Flinn Gallery. The title Glow hopes to describe something that almost shines from within. The luminous works of these four successful artists, Ryan Crotty, Susan Meyer, Linda Camille Schmidt, and Audrey Stone, intersect with themes of color, transparency, process, and materiality. We invite you to discover how ambient light plays upon color, illuminating artworks that appear to glow, pulsate, and float in space. If you're not yet familiar with the Flinn, it's on the second floor of this building. This is our 94th season. Did you hear me right? 94th season. And 94 years of having a gallery within this library. If you have some history in town, prior to 1999, maybe some of you know it as the Hurlbut Gallery. As I like to say, since 1928, we have exhibited Picasso to Pollock, Matisse to Motherwell, and that only brings you to the mid-century artists. So let me pause and highlight two from that era, Josef and Annie Albers. Our two Flinn Gallery historians report that Josef and Annie Albers have shown here in group shows 7 times. 7 times, together or individually, during the years between 1967 and 1976, and then again in 2020 with an Annie Albers print from our Greenwich Library Permanent Collection group show. This particular print can be found just down the hallway from here. Therefore, it is with real pleasure to welcome back the Albers Foundation and its executive director, Fritz Horstman. Since 2004, Fritz has lectured and given workshops at the Bauhaus, the Royal Academy of Art in London, Yale University, and many other institutions. He has curated exhibitions in Italy, Ireland, Croatia, Norway, and the United States. Also, as an artist, he has shown sculptures, installations, and drawings in recent exhibitions across Europe and the U.S. He received his BA from Kenyon College and his MFA from Maryland Institute College of Art. Glow aims to enrich and engage audiences of all ages, and with that, we are excited to bring you tonight's lecture as another means of learning to develop a sensitive and critical eye for color relatedness. It is my honor and pleasure to turn tonight's focus to Fritz Horstman. Thank you. Give him a hand.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for inviting me to begin with and for the very nice introduction. Thank you to the library for hosting me. Just one small correction in the introduction, and only because it's possible that someone else might see this because it's being recorded. I'm not, in fact, the executive director. I'm just the education director. But education is very important. Well, I've been summoned here this evening to discuss the artwork, the color thinking of Josef Albers and how it relates to the 4 artists in the exhibition upstairs. And I hope that if you haven't yet seen that exhibition, you will go see it. It is absolutely beautifully laid out. The 4 artists who are in it are each individually very strong artists, but together, as with so many good things, the sum is greater than the individual parts. So these 4 artists, Linda Camille Schmidt, Susan Meyer, Audrey Stone, and Ryan Crotty, are those artists. I'm going to first walk us through some of Josef Albers' own artwork and then some of his color teachings. And eventually not eventually, it's not going to be that long, but in a bit, I'm going to then draw comparisons to these artists and some of the ideas that Albers himself was up to. Josef Albers, seen here around 1940, was born in 1888 in the small town of Bottrop in northwestern Germany. As a young man, he taught in primary schools around his hometown, and eventually, at age 32, made his way to the Bauhaus, School of Art and Design that had just been founded in 1919 in Weimar in southern Germany. At the Bauhaus, he was again a student and was immediately drawn to the glass workshop. This is one of the first things he made there. I include this one because it's one of the first things we know from him, but also because it fits perfectly with the show. If this was available, it would have been a wonderful addition to the show. In this, he's using a material, glass, that has color as its actual essence. It is not something that's put on top of something else. Color here is in the material. It is the material. That bears out across the rest of his entire art career and also teaching career, that color is not just something you put onto something else. It is a material that can be manipulated as other materials could be manipulated. So here he has broken up bottles, he's found glass samples, and he's sort of woven them together in this industrial grid, not in a traditional stained glass sense. He's really cobbling things together in a very organic way. It's very obviously handmade, but the idea of color and form is very present and it's central. A few years later, he came across another glass-making technique where the artist's hand is completely absent. So in this image entitled Factory from 1925, there are two layers of glass, a red layer and a clear layer, and they are fused together. Albers then created a stencil that was laid over that, and the red is sandblasted away to reveal the clear, which appears white here. And so, but that was not done by his hand. A technician was doing that. Then a black layer was enameled over the top of that, again, not in Albers' own hand. For him, color and form is at the fore here. The idea is most present. And I show these two slides next to each other because we see the handmade next to the factory made. And there is a difference there, but the spirit remains. In 1933, under pressure from the Nazi Party, the Bauhaus was closed. The Alberses, Josef had met Anneliese Fleischmann, his wife, who was born in 1899. She was also a student at the Bauhaus. I'm not going to be able to talk about her very much at all tonight, though she is an extremely interesting artist herself. So in 1925, the two of them married, and in 1933, they came together to this country to teach at Black Mountain College, a newly formed School of Art and Design in North Carolina, just outside Asheville. Josef Albers had really done very little painting prior to his arrival in this country. He did no painting when he was at the Bauhaus. He made those glass works. He also made some furniture, but he was not doing any painting. He arrives in this country, never makes another glass work, and focuses entirely on painting. The reasons for why he did that are the subject of someone's future thesis, and it's far too long to get into now, but for whatever reason, he was a painter from 1933 forward. He arrived in this country with about 30 of these bottles of dried pigment that he apparently didn't really ever use because he found that we actually do have tubes of paint in this country. But he didn't know that coming here. They didn't know where North Carolina was when they agreed to come. They knew it was going to be in the middle of nowhere, and it truly was. They didn't know that they would have a loom when they got there, and so Annie brought a loom with her. Josef brought powdered paint. In any case, he arrives and begins painting. We think this is his very first painting from 1934. It's entitled Black Frame. The eponymous black frame is right there. But beyond that representation of the frame, everything else is pretty purely abstraction. Maybe there's a green plane that's falling out of that frame, but really what we see is how colors are interacting with each other within the picture plane. There's an illusion of some depth that's created through that. One plane seems to float in front of the others, but then it gets confusing as we move further down into the picture plane. I'm sort of speeding through the biography because I want to get to other things here, but in 1949, the Alberses left Black Mountain College and moved to Connecticut. Josef was named chair of the School of Art at Yale University, and they lived the rest of their lives in New Haven and then eventually in Orange, Connecticut. Also in 1950, Josef started making his famous Homage to the Square series of paintings, of which this is an example, also from 1950. He had worked through a number of iterations, and I will sort of work our way back, and we'll see some of those in a minute, to get from that early black frame that we just looked at to this. And through all of that, he's eliminating content so that he can only talk about color. Color was the only thing that was really ultimately interesting to him. He said it was the most malleable medium in art, and that's what drove him to continue investigating in it. From 1950 until 1976, he made just over 2,000 of these paintings survive from that time period. We suspect that quite a few more once upon a time did exist. And in these paintings, he's simply asking us to look at how one color sits next to another, how they interact, how that red sits next to that gray, and how that's different than how the gray sits next to the blue. Space is both very flat and incredibly deep. These very topics show up in his classroom beginning in 1933. On the left, we see him in his classroom at Black Mountain College in 1944. And in 2021, a workshop looks very similar. The students are doing a very similar exercise, and I love that in these two particular photographs, in both cases, separated by decades, students are holding their heads in their hands, sort of grappling with what this strange man is trying to teach them. In both cases, they're looking at the relativity of color, which is to say that one color can change its appearance when surrounded by two different colors. So there, just at Josef Albers' right knee, just a little bit to our left of that, we see a very dark area, or a very dark background with a very light background with two sort of medium grays on top of it. But one of those grays appears darker and one appears lighter. Because I know what he was doing here, I can tell you that those are actually the same grays. They only appear differently because they're surrounded by light in one case and dark in the other. Albers' ideas about teaching color and about thinking about color were compiled in his 1963 publication, Interaction of Color. In 1971, it was published as a paperback and has gone on to become one of the best-selling art books of all time, remains that every year. Every year, it somehow continues to sell more copies, amazingly. It's been published in something like 15 different languages. And very early on, he establishes that our eyes are constantly fooling us. And he does that with this particular demonstration. So I'll ask you to rest your eyes on that small black dot in the center of the red circle. Just keep your eyes right on that black dot. You're looking at that black dot. You know that you're looking at red also, but you're looking at that black dot. I'm going to remove that red. And I suspect some of you are seeing something other than white right now and something other than red. What you are probably seeing is the after image of red, which is a blue-green. And I'm not going to go deep into the psychology or physiology of that, but this is a very strong example of how color deceives us, that there is something different between what our eyes know, what our eyes are taking in. Right now, your eyes have probably readjusted and you know this is just a white plane. And yet, for a while there, your mind was being told by something that it was a blue dot. So there's this discrepancy between what you see and what you know. Also, early on in Interaction of Color, we see this plate demonstrating the relativity of color. So I'm going to walk us through just a few of the key concepts within Interaction of Color. I hope that I'm as clear as possible, but I also am aware that the ideas are a little dense here, so don't feel too frustrated, and also feel free to ask questions later if I'm moving too quickly. But in essence, this is the crash course of Interaction of Color. All right, so we see 6 areas of color here, but focusing just on the 2 browns. One of them may appear to be darker, one may appear to be lighter. But as I remove the blue and yellow flap in the middle, we see that they are a single color of brown that just appears to be 2 different browns. And in color, this can both be true. It can simultaneously be one color and two. These opposing facts can be simultaneously true. All of this was done in Albers's classroom using just colored paper. There was no mixing of paints. It was only colored paper, and that comes back to his idea that color is the material. And of course, colored papers have to be made of something, but you're not mixing paint. You're not learning this skill and then having to sort of goop it on top of something else. You were simply interacting with the colors. Right. So this is the material that was often used, colored paper. It's this very matte surface. And so here is the actual original work that went into interaction of color. Almost all of the plates that went into that book were reproductions of student projects. So Fred Umminger Jr. was a student at Yale in the 1950s, and this was his answer to Albers's prompt of make one color change its appearance. And there is his flap. So moving on from color relativity, or deepening the idea of color relativity, we see these two X's. And the X that's on top of the purple seems to be the same color as the background yellow on the right, and the X that's on top of the right, on top of the yellow, seems to be the same purple as the purple on the left. Did I say that clearly? Okay. Especially if we put our eyes directly in the center where the yellow and the purple mix and just sort of see these X's on our peripheral vision. To me, and I think this particular projection is doing it very well, it really does seem that there's just two colors. So I've slightly altered this slide. Here's the unaltered version, and we see that those two X's are actually conjoined, and they are a single color. They are neither purple nor yellow. They are a color that can exist both as purple and yellow. Albers would say that that X is the optical mixture of purple and yellow. It's a very, very tricky color to actually find, and even harder to actually describe. It's something like a brown, gray, purple, yellow. But it is not a color that if you mixed equal parts of yellow and purple, you would actually get. Either purple or yellow would dominate that mixture, probably the purple, and you would end up with something very muddy. It is a very muddy color, but the physical mixture, that is to say the mixture of the paints, is a different thing than the optical mixture. This is something that we'll see when we start to look at the artists upstairs. There's a lot of control of that optical mixture, of being able to create that color that exists exactly halfway between or not halfway between as the artist decides. So having now mastered this idea of making one color appear to be two different colors, or possibly three colors appearing to be just two colors, if we follow the math here. There are three colors factually here, but we experience them only as two colors. Okay? We move on to the illusion of transparency. All right, so the original of this would have been done just in that same color-aid paper, just flat colored paper. And so how was the person who made this able to make the appearance of these two rectangles that they are overlapping? It looks as though an orange gel has been laid on top of a brown piece of paper or something. And that is done because that interstitial area, the mixture area, or the area that looks like it's translucent, is halfway between. It's the optical mixture of that orange and that brown. Now, this is something that Albers himself used in his own paintings, though not in such a overt representation of space. Here, in one of his Homage to the Square paintings, we see an outside gray and an interior of a reasonably strong yellow, at least relatively to the rest of the image. And then in the middle square, that interstitial square, it is the halfway point between those two colors. And so it really appears as though it's almost a veil that you could simply lift away, and then you would see only two colors. Of course, it's a painting, so we can't do that. An important fact here is that Albers almost never mixed his paints, and he almost never painted one color over another. So although you might think to yourself, well, I could make this illusion simply by painting sort of a light wash over part of the painting. That's not what he did. These are three separate pigments of paint, and I will get a little bit further into that later as to how he was doing that. But he had a particular gray, and he had a particular halfway gray, and then he had a particular yellow, and none of them were mixed. Furthering that idea of the illusion of transparency, we see here 3 rectangles of blue and 3 rectangles of green, and as they are overlapped, the control of that mixture is varied. The one in the middle is the middle mixture. It is the overlapping area is exactly halfway between the blue and the green, and so it isn't clear which the green or the blue is actually sitting on top. Whereas to the left, closer to me, clearly the green sits on top because the mixture is closer to green. And on the far right, clearly the blue sits on top because the mixture is closer to blue. Perhaps easy enough to conceptualize, but actually quite difficult to achieve. I won't walk us through the entire logic of all this. I'll just let you sort of think it through for a moment. So there's much, much more in Interaction of Color. If this is a book that you've not yet come across, I urge you to, if this is interesting, I urge you to check it out. But I'm not going to walk us much further through it. I want to get into the artists upstairs and how they might relate to this. But first, I want to show one more image from Josef Albers. This is another one of his glass works made shortly after that very first one that I showed, the broken bottle one. He has not yet gotten to the sandblasted imagery that we saw early on. Entitled Park, it still is showing that handmadeness. This is clearly not something that would have been made in a factory. It's made by the artist's hands. It is very much a translucent material. We see the light moving through it. We see the color coming out of the material because the color is in the material. And even as it is a translucent material, it is evoking more images of translucency. The way that he has arranged the grid and arranged the colors within it, we see more depth. We see more of this illusion of transparency and illusion of depth that he's building into that. All right, so I'm going to move to my written remarks now. I will sort of be bouncing back and forth. I know the Albers material cold, but needed to be sure I said the right things about these other artists. Linda Camille Schmidt uses colorful textiles in single, double, triple, and sometimes quadruple orthogonal layers of opaque and translucent panes. Framed two, split, we see here, quickly settles into a pattern of dark and bright rectangles, sewn and pinned together in a space that is physically quite shallow, but that through Schmidt's masterful use of color and texture opens into a deep and complicated scene. There are a number of these framed images upstairs from Schmidt, and they are indeed quite physically shallow. She uses small plastic spacers to create a little bit of depth so that the light can actually get in and interact, but they're framed. They're in picture frames. The dark red vertical strip in the middle splits the scene into like a wall. Though made of soft materials, Schmidt's work feels architectural. And largely that's because, or not largely, but an aspect of that is because it is so orthogonal, meaning it's on right angles. They're soft right angles, and she's interestingly juxtaposing the sort of the rigidity of architecture with this very soft material, simultaneously juxtaposing the softness of the material and the colors of the materials in high and low contrasts. The 3 horizontal bars across the top of cadence evince the 3 layers of fabric that Schmidt has overlapped and conflated to create this very large work, almost 12 feet tall. Standing before it, one senses warmth. An almost haptic sense of softness is conveyed not only through the gossamer fabrics, but through the choices of color. Only in a few select places has Schmidt created areas of high contrast. The majority of the color interactions are low in contrast. Sections of white translucent fabric in the foreground frame and diffuse darker colors behind them. All of these conscious and instinctive decisions create a complicated and invitingly rich world of color and texture. And though these 2 pieces on the right by Schmidt aren't included in the exhibition upstairs, seeing them in relation to the architecture of the previous installation is informative, and paired with Albers's Park, the shared sensitivity to color that is itself the material not something laid over another material, as in paint, is evident. In both cases, translucence is magnified. I'm going to take a slight diversion here to Buckminster Fuller, the American architect, inventor, and futurist who coined, amongst many other terms, Spaceship Earth, capturing both his utopian philosophy and communal ethic. Most widespread of his architectural ideas is the geodesic dome. Though a version of that had been built by others in Germany in the 1920s, Fuller took the idea much further, and it is with him that we most commonly associate the idea. Working with students at Black Mountain College in 1948, he made his first attempt. Here we see the model for the structure along with Fuller himself at center, the painter Elaine de Kooning at right, and Josef Albers with his camera in the background. What would become known as the supine dome was an abject failure, in that it couldn't support its own weight. With scant funding, Fuller had attempted to build it with Venetian blinds, and in fact, didn't even have enough money for all of the Venetian blinds. He claims that there were supposed to be 2 layers of Venetian blinds, and somehow the tension and structure would make the whole thing hold up, but they only had funds for 1 layer of Venetian blinds, and here is the result. Returning the following summer, Fuller realized his first successful geodesic dome, which went on to be copied and spread throughout the world. Fuller's ethics often traveled with it, and it became a common structure on the site of communes that sprouted up in the following decades. Josef Albers, who had invited Fuller to Black Mountain College, was obviously interested in his work. A series of coincident drawings, which became prints and engravings known as structural constellations, was a preoccupation of Albers's, running parallel to and sometimes bleeding into his paintings and color thinking. I should point out that this series from Albers, which numbers in the many hundreds, predates his interactions by Fuller by at least a decade, though the similarities indicate that there was something in the air. Though two-dimensional, they conjure a geometric space akin to Fuller's geodesic domes. In the 1930s and 40s, while Albers was beginning to include illusions of transparency in his classroom, those complicated geometric forms became containers for the color in his paintings. And here we end our detour with Buckminster Fuller. Susan Meyer creates complicated geometric structures that echo the formal and ethical ambitions of both Fuller and Albers. I put these 3 together simply so we can see just how strong the visual correspondence is. Meyer is interested in defunct utopian communes, which naturally includes Fuller's geodesic domes. Having served their architectural purpose for housing failed utopias, Meyer now repurposes the idiom to house ideas. The airy and fractal openness of the structures make the small sculptures that nest in and on her sculptures feel all the more dense. Light moves through the colored panes, changing at different times of day and from different angles. They are accumulations of historical forms and ideologies crystallized in colors that must be experienced in the present moment. Meyer's geodesic balls appear to be geodesic domes caught either in a moment of deflation or inflation. The ethics and ambition of Fuller's generation are present, but are forced to, or have fallen into new configurations. Meyer acknowledges the unlikelihood of their originator's success, making sculptures that are neither utopian nor dystopian. They are perhaps simply topian, from the Greek topos, meaning place. They are sculptures of a particular place, seen at a particular time. Their color and form is happening here and now. Returning to interaction of color, we see a slide demonstrating the Weber-Fechner law, which states, The visual perception of an arithmetical progression depends upon a physical geometric progression. Clear as day, isn't it? That is to say that in order to double the intensity of a pigment, to back that up. The first that we see here, 4 overlapping rectangles. Where 2 of them overlap, it's easy to see that it's simply twice as dark as where there's only a single one. Where 3 of them overlap, it is not twice again, it is only a quarter again as dark as the first. And where all 4 overlap, it is barely distinguishable from where only 3 overlap. So there's a geometrical addition of pigments there. This is something that Ernst Heinrich Weber of Weber-Fechner first observed when lifting weights. He realized that, for example, if you lift 5 pounds, the difference between lifting 5 pounds and 10 pounds is just doubling that. But the experience of lifting just 5 more pounds after that is not the same as the difference between 5 and 10 pounds. Your experience of that, at least Weber's experience of that, was that it was half as much again. His student, Gustav Fechner, expanded that to other perceptual ideas. I think of this also in cooking. If you have no salt in your soup and you add 1 part salt, you suddenly taste the salt. If you double that, it doesn't taste twice as salty. It tastes just a little bit more salty. If you double that again, or add 1 more part again, it doesn't taste triply salty, it's just a little bit more salty. At a certain point, it becomes so salty that it's just salty. And that's essentially what's happening in the center of this, that it's just so salty that we can't see it anymore. Not sure I totally nailed that explanation, but I feel that you're all along with me. So Albers continues, because I think this is a reasonably difficult concept, with this second slide. On the left, we see the arithmetic addition. So at the top, we start with red, and then 1 part of black is added, then a second part of black is added, and a third part of black, and then a 4th part of black. And down at the bottom, we barely see any difference between 3 parts of black and 4 parts of black. There's a very small difference there. On the right, it's a geometrical addition. So we start with the same red, add 1 part black, so it's the same interaction or same difference between the 1 and 2, and then add 2 more parts of black. And so we get a larger step. And then we add 4 parts of black, and then finally we add 8 parts of black. And through that, we actually have the perception of that arithmetical difference, but it is achieved through a geometrical addition of colors. Audrey Stone understands this deeply. Paintings such as Close, again, take the basic idea behind the Weber-Fechner law to an extreme. Beginning either in the center or at the edge, Stone paints a strip in a chosen color, add an immeasured amount of a second color to the original she paints. She paints a second strip directly adjacent to the first. 1 more part of the second color is added, and a third strip is painted, on and on until the canvas is covered, or she changes her mind and moves a different direction. This arithmetic addition of colors creates the curved appearance that both Albers and Weber-Fechner would have predicted. So going back, so Stone is using essentially what's on the left here, the arithmetical addition, and that creates this curved appearance, right, where the gradation creates a feeling of a curve, and something similar is happening in this painting. It doesn't feel as it's a single smooth slant out from the center. It feels as though it's like a funnel that's bending in. In detail, we feel that even more. Though extremely precise, Stone's paintings hum with vitality. I have no idea of Stone's musical preferences, but I will risk a comparison to the composer Alvin Lucier, whose minimalist compositions seem to grow and curve, though they are primarily comprised of repeated ideas that are serially worked through in every possible configuration within the parameters that the composer has set. Stone, too, sets the parameters. She doesn't know precisely what the resulting painting will be, but trusts her process and materials. Surface is important in Josef Albers' paintings. He's very aware of them as objects. They are painted on masonite, which is construction material. It's a composite board. It has a rough side and a smooth side. These two paintings, on the left, we see one painted on the smooth side. That's that same one we saw before. And on the right, painted on the rough side. And so you start to see that texture. Here you see those two paintings at an angle, at a raking light, so you can see more easily what I'm talking about. The back of this painting reveals exactly how Albers made it. On the back of almost all of his paintings, there's what we call a recipe. And that recipe tells us exactly what pigments he used and in which order. So I will try to read this, though his handwriting is often a bit sloppy. So he's titled this one RIC5, which means something to him. And then it says, ground, 6 coats of Liquitex gesso from the company Permanent Pigment. Painting, paints used from center, cadmium red extra, scarlet from Shiva, cadmium red light from Preferred, cadmium scarlet from Winsor Newton, all in one primary coat, all directly from the tube. The varnish is a polyvinyl acetate in Tuline, from the company Taus, and then his signature and date. So cadmium red extra scarlet, cad red light, and cad scarlet, 3 very similar colors, and yet we see them differentiating here. Albers used over 800 individual paints over the 26 years that he worked on his Homage to the Square paintings. Because he kept such fastidious notes about his paintings, we're able to say that there are 800 different pigments. Ryan Crotty uses only 3 pigments. To make these paintings, Crotty applies very thin layers of his material, which is an acrylic mixed into a gloss gel that is then pulled with a squeegee across the surface of the canvas to make a very, very thin layer. And because that it's a very high gloss paint that is translucent, light travels through the paint and then bounces off of the white canvas and comes back to us. So what we're actually seeing is light bouncing off of the white and then traveling through those pigments and mixing right before our eyes. The structures, the forms that emerge in these are simply because there's some sort of resistance beneath the painting, beneath the canvas, as he pulls the squeegee across it. I chose this one, even though it's not actually in the exhibition, to show here because we can really see the stretcher bars. It's pretty evident exactly what's happened here. He's gooped his paint on there and then he squeegeed it through, and we see the stretcher bars in their actual form. How the actual specific colors come through is physics, that we're just seeing light moving through pigments, but it's also a bit alchemical. I think I understand the process, but I'm still completely in awe of how this actually produces anything. Crotty's paintings are something like an inside-out Albers painting, where Albers used hundreds of different colors and almost never laid one on top of another. Crotty uses only 3 colors, which are always layered. Albers was keenly aware of the front and back of his paintings and that the masonite, stretcher bars, and frame were there to support the image, which was reliant on the substrate's texture. Crotty's paintings reached through his canvas to reveal the form of the support structure, simultaneously revealing the canvas itself. Both use a minimum of means to create a wide array of visual experiences, and in many cases, beguiling illusions of depth. In conclusion, Josef Albers was an artist who was very comfortable with parameters. He made more or less the same painting for 26 years in a row. He understood that by limiting options, one can go much further. He set up parameters very specifically because he knew that that would allow him to move in one direction and not flounder all over the place trying to find the way to go. He wanted to go. The artists in Glow instinctively work in the same way. Though their practices may reach in directions not discussed tonight, the work presented here exhibits discipline and rigor. Each artist adheres to particular techniques and materials, pushing them in astounding directions so that each piece resonates with its own voice. One more example from Interaction of Color. This is an exercise that Albers called the Four Worlds, in which quantity of color is discussed. The assignment would be every student would have 4 colors and would need to make 4 compositions using all 4 of those colors. Each composition would include all 4 colors, and there would be some unifying visual motif. And within those very strict parameters, the 4 compositions would need to look as different from one another as possible. Albers said that the Four Worlds assignment could be thought of also as 4 instruments in the orchestra. Each instrument is playing the same piece, but in a different register and in a unique harmony. Or actors in a play. The same script could be read by 4 actors exchanging parts, and the results would be 4 very different plays. It could be said that Albers' entire Homage to the Square project is one extended version of this Four Worlds idea, but these particular 4 homages really work us through that. They are all 4 using the same 3 colors, but in different configurations, different quantities, and I think you'll agree that they appear quite different from one another, although obviously unified. So let us consider this in regards to the artists in Glow. None of the artists in Glow are working directly in the wake of Josef Albers. Each is doing their own thing and beautifully. Albers' long career in eloquent pedagogy provides reference points to discuss what each artist is doing, though by no means do I want to limit the possibilities for other understandings of their work. The examples and comparisons I've given are but a few in a much wider ongoing conversation. Albers himself compared what happened in his classroom to lessons in grammar. You can't write poetry until you learn the rules of language. These artists are all very well versed in the grammar and are deeply engaged in the poetry. It is impossible to know what Josef Albers would think of this exhibition, though I suspect he would like it very much. I can say with certainty that he would applaud the continued investigations of material, process, and of the discrepancy between the physical fact of color and its psychic effect. Susan Meyer, Linda Camille Schmidt, Ryan Crotty, and Audrey Stone, as well as the exhibition curator, Ellen Hawley, are each in their own way expanding our understanding of the question that fascinated Albers for his entire career: what happens between our eyes and our minds? Thank you.
Fritz, that was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I feel so honored that he put all this thesis work into it. Please stay put. We have some good Q&A coming up. Thank you, Kira, for also sharing a mic. And I don't know, I'm pretty astounded by the work that you put into this, and I can't thank you enough. So another round of applause. The 4 artists also extend their thanks to Fritz, too, for his time in looking at their art. We have 1 artist here of the 4. They're spread out in different places. I should just say, I'm asked this question a lot. Linda and Audrey live in Brooklyn. Ryan Crotty lives in Nebraska. He's represented by a gallery in the Lower East Side by High Noon. And Susan Meyer splits her time between Hudson, New York, and New Jersey, teaching in art in a college. So, any questions here in this group? I have one right here, and then maybe get ready for the second one. Yes?
Since so much of this is based on perception, I was just wondering about those who are colorblind. if he had ever interviewed or took into consideration, they would be like a different animal.
Great question. So did Albers engage with color blindness in any form? Undoubtedly. He did not specifically write about it or talk about it that I know of. However, as education director at the Albers Foundation, I teach color a great deal, and in almost every workshop group that I work with, someone, if they're comfortable, tells me that they're colorblind in whatever way. There's a huge percentage of specifically genetic males who are red-green colorblind. It's something like 1 in 12. So in a group of 30 people, there's a pretty good chance one person is going to have something, and sometimes more. And it's fascinating. Colorblindness almost always happens in hue, which is to say it's happening in the cones. I'm not going to go too deep in the physiology here, because I can't. But our cones take in hue, which is to say is it red, green, blue, yellow, purple, whatever, and our rods take in value, which is to say lightness and darkness. And so colorblindness generally only affects the cones, and so hue would be what, and generally if it's red-green colorblindness, it's only one of the cones or one of the types of cones. And so value is still present. And so in that very first example that I showed, not that one. This is reliant on hue. So even if you were completely colorblind, if you only saw the world in black and white, or what wouldn't be black and white to you would be the world, you would still see this as a lighter and a darker. So when I encounter this when I'm teaching, I always try to make people comfortable, of course, but then push things towards value, because that's really where a lot of this ends up happening in Albers. Great question, though.
Does Albers, in his theory, address where you place the squares? Because the squares tend to be towards the bottom of, they're not centered in the middle of the piece of masonite.
Correct. They are lower in the composition. He never completely explained that. He said a lot of interesting things about these. He said he wanted the square to live in the same gravity that you do, which is why it's centered low. He said he didn't want it to appear like a hallway. If it was perfectly centered, it would have this tunnel effect. I certainly can experience a tunneling effect if I look at these in the right state of mind. Those are the two that come to mind. I think he said some other things, but those are what quickly come to mind.
Could you speak to the way the old masters and impressionists might have known intuitively some of the things that Albers ultimately discovered more specifically?
Sure. How the impressionists and previous generations and old masters might have known about this. So this idea that we were just looking at of color relativity is also known, sorry, I'm missing the term here, simultaneous contrast, where the contrast on one side informs the contrast on the other side, which in turn informs the contrast on the first side, and they sort of back and forth. They're reinforcing one another. And this was first published by John Locke in the 17th century, not about color, but about perception. Almost all of the things that Albers brings up apply in other perceptions also. And so Locke gives the example of 3 buckets of water. You've got a hot bucket, a cold bucket, and a tepid bucket. And you put one hand in the hot bucket, you put one hand in the cold bucket, and you let them acclimatize. And then you take them out, and you put the hot hand in the tepid bucket, and it's going to feel cold. You put the cold hand in the tepid bucket, and it's going to feel hot. So this is simultaneous contrast happening in our haptic perception. So not that everyone was reading Locke for centuries and centuries, but these ideas were out there. Almost nothing that Albers used in his class was his own discovery. He put things together in his own course and then interaction of color in this particularly accessible way, sort of crystallizing these ideas in a way that gives them to us in a coherent form. The Impressionists, I'm not going to say all of them, but some of them would have known of the work of a Swiss chemist named Chevril, who might have been the first person to apply simultaneous contrast to the idea of colors. And so people like Seurat or pointillists were actively using this idea in their paintings.
I thought you were going to say if you took your hand out of the warm bucket and then put it in the cold bucket and tasted it, it would be salty. I was just waiting for that. I don't know. But I do love the way Fritz is very natural in making these very relevant comparisons. Any questions on this side, or do you have one over there? Okay, go ahead.
Do you know if he documented his paintings on the verso with the intention that someone might replicate the piece?
That's a great question. Because he left such deep, copious notes on the back of the paintings, that same information that we saw is repeated underneath the stretcher bar on the back of the painting, and again in his own private notebooks. And presumably, none of that was meant to be public knowledge. He was just very thoroughly keeping track of what he was up to. He repeated certain combinations many, many times, never the exact three or four colors at the same time, but 2 together, or then 3 or together, whatever. And so these seem to be really his working notes as he's working through his own understanding of color. And it's often quite sloppy. He abbreviates things, and it's a bit hard to read. One of my colleagues at the Albers Foundation is writing the Catalogue Raisonné of Josef Albers' paintings. Catalogue Raisonné is the authoritative volume of all known works by a particular artist. And so we've learned a great deal from her as she's gone through all this material. And I think jokingly, but also not really jokingly, she thinks that those notes on the back of the paintings are love letters from Josef Albers to her, because no one cares about them as much as she does.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask about, I think the thing that's always struck me about especially this interaction of color as like not just a publication or a concept, but as a pedagogy, like as a class. And I think of, Albers, both Joseph and Ani being in Black Mountain College, which was such a like free form thinking place, and then going to Yale. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about like sort of the like the teaching atmosphere that brought Albers to Yale or to New Haven, and how experimental a class like this was. I don't know, do you know what I mean? Just like sort of talk about that a little bit. Okay,
great question. It's a huge question also, so I'm going to have to sort of wind my way through it. The difference between Albers' students in the 3 major institutions that he worked at, Bauhaus, Black Mountain College, and Yale, are significant. Probably the biggest difference was between the Bauhaus and the American universities, for a bunch of reasons, right? Different countries for one, but also the Bauhaus was a school of art and design. The students were expected to come out to be professionalized artists and designers, architects in many cases. Black Mountain College was not even accredited, and it was a liberal arts college. And so some of those students went on to be artists and architects, but many did not. They were mathematicians or geographers or whatever else. Yale, similar to Black Mountain, is a liberal arts college. And certainly a lot of artists have come out of Yale, but a lot of Albers' students at Yale didn't go on to be artists. And so I think his teaching style between the Bauhaus and Black Mountain, there was a huge shift in what he was doing. A lot of the ideas sort of transferred and changed, and I can't go in, there's so much here that I want to tell you everything, but I must leave some things to the side. And they get to Black Mountain College, and a lot of the ideas there inherently just have to be dialed back. The students don't have 35 hours of studio time every week, as they did at the Bauhaus, to work through Albers' assignments. They only had 3 or 4 hours. And so things had to be dialed back and modified. And then he comes to Yale, and he's at that point, he arrives at Yale in 1950, he's 62 years old. The pedagogy, the curriculum of his classes at Yale looks mighty similar to the curriculum at Black Mountain College. Yale still does have the oldest art program within an American university. It was founded, the art school was founded something like 1860 or something, and was and still is one of the most famous. But across the early 20th century, it had become a very conservative school of sort of the Beaux-Arts style of, sunsets and horses and things, which are beautiful, but not particularly modern in the modernist sense. And administration at Yale was aware of that, and obviously this was not a complete agreement amongst all the administrators, but they brought Albers in specifically to modernize Yale's School of Art. And in doing so, I think he felt he had an imperative, what's the word here? A mandate to do exactly as he pleased, or to do what he was known for doing. And so he came in and ruffled some feathers for sure, but I think he kind of knew what he was up to at that point.
I have a question down here.
Yeah.
Actually, as I come meet this person, I wanted to just add that yesterday I was in the gallery and I was asked to give a private tour to a visitor who, this woman was 91, and she got her undergraduate degree in art at Smith College, and she went on to get her master's degree at Yale and worked under Josef Albers. And she was a fascinating person to speak with, but she really just, still, his lessons in color resonate with her. And she was like a kid in a candy store in our gallery, and she was talking about each piece and how much is that? I couldn't stop her, but it was wonderful, wonderful visit. You have a question? Do you still have a question?
Okay. This question is very rudimentary. I hope I'm not wasting people's time, but going way back to maybe before we talk about this, I would like to ask you, since you seem so knowledgeable, I've been trying to distinguish for years all the difference between value, tones, tints, intensity. I read books. I do everything I can to kind of figure out what is the difference here going on. And I may find out tonight or may not. It's up to you. But help me.
No
It's
pressure.
an excellent question.
Okay, I'm going to choose an Aubrey Stone painting to work us through something here. But there's a lot within that question, and I'm going to do what I can. When I teach a color course, as I suppose I sort of am right now, I try to establish 3 or maybe 4 qualities of color that we can all agree on. And those are hue, which is to say, what color is it? Is it red, yellow, green, blue, purple, whatever? So hue. Value, which is the lightness or darkness. In more scientific terms, how much light is coming off of the surface and landing in your eye. And so value can be different for 2 different people in a room, because the light might be bouncing differently for me off of that wall than for you, because I've got all the light on me right now. And then saturation, which is the intensity of the color. How much pigment is in a particular color. So we could also say how strong that color is. So saturation and strength are more or less synonymous. A color that has a lot of pigment in it is very strong. A color that's been mixed with something else tends to get weaker, and that means it's being desaturated. So this particular painting, we see 2 hues, red and yellow. White is not actually a hue. And I suppose the red is heading into, is it heading into purple up there? Or is that, okay. So there's 3 hues. And because of that process that I sort of explained of adding 1 part to each new strip as she's mixing her colors, just moving from the yellow into the white, we see it is gradually becoming a desaturated yellow that eventually becomes so desaturated that it ceases to be yellow and just becomes white. As we continue to go right, it's moving from yellow back into red, and those middle, sort of the orangey colors, are a mixture of yellow and red, and I don't think that you're using any orange in there. I think you're just using the yellow and red to make the mix. So it's magenta on the far right, magenta in the upper left also? Okay.
House.
In any case, the mixture of the magenta and the yellow is not producing a fully saturated orange. It's producing a very sort of a desaturated version of the two of them. Okay? Value and saturation often ride together because the stronger color it is, often the darker it is, because often you're desaturating with white, but you can also desaturate with black, which tends to make things lower in value. So, hue, value, saturation, and then finally temperature. Temperature, I think many people instinctively sort of understand, or we just through turning faucets on and off, we know that red is hot and blue is cold, and that the colors similar to red, so orange and yellow, often we think of as being warm, and the cool colors are blue and green and purple. But you can create a pretty cold red if you surround it with the right colors, or you can make a pretty warm blue, again, if you surround it with the right colors.
How are we all doing? I'm doing a temperature check now. Cold, warm, still going? Just give us a show of hands of how many more questions we have. We want to kind of just gauge our timing. We have 1, 2, 3, possibly. Okay. We can manage that, I think.
I'm fine, but also it's 8:05,
Yep,
and I think we advertised till 8:15.
8:15.
So 3 is perfect.
Okay. I was also just going to say that in the gallery we are doing color workshops with kids. We worked with a collaboration for some of these programmings with the library, and these kids come into the gallery and they're working with this great little setup of color mixing with. I'm not explaining this well. It's been a long day, but plastic sheets that then are of different colors and they can mix them. We're having a color conversation. I'm thinking I need to scale to keep it kind of simple. So we're talking about pink. And then all of a sudden the kids are talking about aquamarine, teal. They said fuchsia and magenta, and they shocked me. And I realized the parent chimed in and said, you know, the kids have color vocabulary because of the Crayola box of crayons and the names on them. And I realized it's absolutely true that the youngest of kids have this vocabulary, and I think somewhere along the way we tend to maybe lose a little bit of that. So it's just insight to say, she actually said to me, what's the difference between fuchsia and magenta? And I said, well, wow, you know, I think one might have a little more orange, and we got into a long conversation. Question, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Horstman, if you could tell us, please, how were the abstract expressionists who were working at the same time and maybe were even taught by Albers, not sure, how were they influenced without copying him in their collage and everything? Because color was so important to them. Thank you.
Great question. How did the abstract expressionists learn from Albers? Albers was not a great fan of the abstract expressionists. You might just instinctively know that. Nevertheless, he welcomed them into his institutions. He was aware that having only a single voice was not going to be the best education for his students. And so the reason Elaine de Kooning was in that photograph was because Albers had invited Willem de Kooning to Black Mountain College to teach with him. And he also invited de Kooning to Yale to teach with him. So these were pretty antithetical teachers. What Albers said about abstract expressionist painting was, this is a quote from someone you all know, or may know. Ken Reason lives just a few towns away and has had an exhibition in this very gallery, was a student of Albers's. He told me that Albers said that that's not painting, that's gravity. Obviously, a pithy statement from him. Many of his students in the 1950s were actively trying to become abstract expressionists. This was the hip thing to be doing in art school. And when asked about what he would do with these students, he said, I would ask them to make the same painting again, and then make it again, and then make it again, and then you will know what you have done. So that doesn't exactly answer your question, but one final note within that, or note on that topic, Robert Rauschenberg was not particularly an abstract expressionist painter, but he's from that generation more or less, and we can say a sort of a sloppy artist. And I say that with great affection. I love Rauschenberg. He was a student of Josef Albers at Black Mountain College. and said years later, well after he'd achieved fame, said that he was still working through the ideas that Josef Albers taught him, that Albers taught him more than any other artist had ever taught him. There's a microphone, there you go.
Hi. I guess my question is about the time period that he was operating. He leaves Germany, obviously, during the 30s, and to what and his work becomes, it appears, more abstract. Do you think that was because he wanted to keep his voice, it has changed the voice that he wants to speak in a way, paint in because of the historical and political context of the time?
I'm going to try to rephrase the question just so I've got it clear. Did his paintings reflect the politics, or was there something else going on? And his style. It's a big question, and I can't say for sure, of course, because I'm not him. He did say that the art needed to stand on its own, and that he was not interested in making political art. Both in regards to World War II and then the Vietnam era, he was criticized for not making political art. And both he and Annie, his wife, responded the same way, saying that art is above politics. It shouldn't be, it's timeless. I think that he was so interested in the formal qualities of art that to include representational, and which is to say non-abstract imagery, took away from those formal qualities in his eyes. That if he wanted you to just look at red, making a painting of a red sailboat, you would be thinking about a sailboat and maybe also the color red, but he really just wanted red.
That's impressive. You managed to answer that. Question in the center, and I think that's our last, or how are we doing? Last one? Great, thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so Albers' color paintings preceded Rothko. Did they work together at all, or did they know each other, or?
They definitely knew of each other. I would bet that both of them wished the other didn't exist. And in fact, Rothko's sort of, I call them the refrigerator paintings, slightly predate the Homage to the Square. But there's no evidence that Albers had any idea that they were happening. That I think they landed on the same idea. Something like the comparison between Buckminster Fuller and Albers that I made. I think there was just kind of something in the air that they both Buckminster Fuller and Albers ended up with these very linear, crystallized structures that held ideas in a certain way. And Rothko and Albers both landed on a vaguely similar idea from very different angles. But there's no historical evidence that they knew one another or had any interactions. Yeah.
I think we've done it. You've done it. So thank you so much. Round of applause. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Color is so basic to everybody, and this gives us a chance to slow down and lean in.
You're very welcome.